Hey everyone, in today's video, I'll be sharing with you how you can turn around worse positions with counterplay by creating threat after threat and grabbing the initiative. Make sure to stick around because after the game, that's where I put everything together and explain how you can apply this process to your game as well. So in this position, you can see that black is a bit clearly better because of his open file for the rook, his queen targeting my b4 pawn, which is really important because it can be pushed forward, and black is later going to put more pressure and basically attack till he wins it. And meanwhile, my knight really can't jump in anytime soon because his pawn restricts it pretty nicely, and my rook here also can't go to b1 because the light squared bishop is looking at that square as well. So in this position, I'm a bit stuck and I really don't know what to do, and I decided to play h3 because I just want to create some breathing room for my king, and perhaps in the future when my rook does get the chance to basically develop, I don't have to worry about back rank. But in this position, my opponent immediately plays rook a4, and I realized that I have no way to protect the pawn and I'll be losing it. So instead of trying to focus on how to basically try and save the pawn or try to push it perhaps and find an optimal way to lose it, I instead try to create counterplay and target other side of the board. And here I play queen g3, immediately aligning my queen with the king and threatening to play bishop h6 and win the pawn back basically. And here my opponent sidesteps with the king and I continue making the threats, and here I play bishop e5. I induce him to play f6, which basically weakens his pawn structure a lot more. The light squares around the king are much weaker and can be targeted, not to mention the rook is staring down at the e6 pawn, which will be a target if this light squared bishop ever moves in the future. So in this position, I go forward with bishop d6, and again I am creating another threat of trying to take the bishop and infiltrate in with the queen, and if he takes, I'll perhaps take with the pawn as well, try to create some sort of passed pawn and create threats that way. And here my opponent just takes my pawn on b4 and I continue with queen c3, and now I have the threat of taking the bishop, and once the queen takes, I take the rook on b4. So it's basically using the fact that the queen is overloaded, protecting the dark squared bishop and the rook on b4. And in this position, my opponent first takes the dark squared bishop, and once I take back, I get my passed pawn, and even though it looks like a weakness, black has no immediate way to target it other than with his queen, and in that case I'll also slide to g3 or move forward to c5 and I'll protect my pawn. And long term, I shouldn't be losing it without a fight, and it's more of black who's annoyed trying to deal with it and try to stop it. And in this position, my opponent goes back trying to stop queen c5 but also keeping his rook protected so he can move his queen. I play g4 here, basically using the fact that the light squared bishop was tied down to protecting the pawn. I'm trying to kick it out and win the pawn back. So here, as you can see, actually I'm no longer going to be down a pawn simply because I was creating threat after threat. And this is the thing I want you guys to understand and use in your games. Basically, when you realize you're going to be losing material, try to use the tempo to create other threats, because your opponent will spend time taking that extra material and that'll give you time to go somewhere else, focus and create your own threats. And as you see, the past few moves, I've set up my pieces to basically create threats and induce weaknesses, which I can later capitalize and win back material. Here my opponent goes to e4 with the bishop, trying to block my rook, but it's important here that I don't take and win the pawn this way, because I'm going into a queen and rook endgame. My king is definitely a bit more weak here, and it's harder to basically take advantage of the light squares around the king, and this pawn is now actually more of a weakness because the rook is now going to d5 as well. So instead of trying to win the pawn back that way, I simply play f3, I further restrict the bishop, and once it goes back, I win the pawn this way because now my rook is activating and infiltrating into the position. And if you want to understand how you can take decisions in your game as well, better to play f3 or play knight e4. I have another video on where I discuss on how to evaluate positions and move forward, so check it out. And going back to this video, after I win the pawn, my opponent plays queen d7, hitting the rook and the pawn at the same time, and of course I want to keep my passed pawn as it's my biggest asset. So here I simply defend my rook with queen e3, and my opponent really doesn't have any immediate ways to remove my rook on e6. If he tries to play bishop f7, I play rook e7, I attack the queen, attack the bishop, and I'll be winning the bishop. So here my opponent goes back with rook b8, perhaps trying to trade rooks or play rook d8 and put more pressure on the passed pawn to try and blockade it. Here I simply play f4, and my idea is really simple. I want to lock this position in with f5 and have really strong control over e6, so then I can further slowly infiltrate. Not to mention, I'm also looking at ideas to bring my knight into the game with f3 and perhaps h4, g5 in the future to slowly break open the king. So here my opponent plays bishop c2, trying to get out of the way of the pawn chain that's going to be blocking in the bishop. However, this is actually a big mistake. Here my opponent had to play king g8 with the idea of playing bishop f7. So when I play rook e7, it's not a double attack because the bishop is protected, so the queen can move and take my pawn, and it's basically still an equal position somewhat, because black does win a pawn, but white maintains the initiative and does infiltrate into black's position. However, in this position, any other move is basically a mistake, and my opponent plays bishop c2, and here I play f5. Now I protect my rook, and I can focus on moves like queen f4, further protecting my pawn even more, so my rook can move to squares like e7 and further infiltrate. And in this position, my opponent tries to basically chip away at this pawn structure with h5, because his bishop is looking at the f5 pawn. So if I take on h5, basically it ruins my pawn structure and it allows black to come back into the game. But now I take advantage of the fact that his king is on the same file and it's basically a bit open. So first I play queen g3, and I'm simply threatening to play queen h4 and infiltrate this way, and now the king is my main target and pawn structures are secondary. And here my opponent plays rook d8, trying to basically put more pressure on my passed pawn, trying to keep an eye on it so he can move his queen perhaps. But it's a bit too late, because now I play queen h4, and I'm not even losing the pawn because the queen is leading the attack here, so he can't take because I'll just be winning the queen. And here he's also basically just going to lose the pawn because I'm attacking it twice and it's also pinned. Here my opponent tries to create counterplay with queen takes d4, basically infiltrating into my position, and perhaps find some sort of way to give perpetual checks and also just win the knight here. And this is where I had to be careful. Both of us were down on time, or actually my opponent had like 4 minutes. I was down to less than a minute, and here I realized I had to create threats that were basically exceeding black's threats here, basically not giving him any time to take on d4. And here I play queen takes h5 with check, and then I play rook e8 check, and after trade I realized I'll be pushing the pawn and making a second queen inevitably, and I'll end up checkmating. But first I had to play knight f3, making sure that black doesn't infiltrate, making sure I don't give him counterplay. So in this video I hope not only you're learning how to create counterplay with threats, but also making sure your opponent doesn't have any counterplay, because it's important that I defend this pawn, don't allow him to infiltrate, and when he spends another move trying to attack my knight and come in, that gives me enough time to push my pawn and make a queen. And here he takes my knight, and for a brief moment I just say, oh no, my knight, I sacrifice a piece, and I give a check on g6. It's important that I don't queen. Of course I think I'm still winning, but I do allow queen takes d4 and things get very messy, especially since I'm under time pressure. Or I might not, actually I should be, the queen on e8 should help me defend once I move my king, but still there's no point in allowing all this. I give a check first and I force the king back, and then I checkmate, and this is game over. So hopefully in today's video you learned how to create counterplay by trying to grab the initiative, inducing weaknesses, and then creating threat after threat until you slowly infiltrate. And see you next video.